Hello, welcome to this Pulsar Consulting webinar. Today we are joined by an expert panel to discuss operational resilience. Thank you everybody for joining the discussion, and we anticipate this being highly valuable for you all to hear some wider industry perspectives. I'm Simon Chard and I'm delighted to introduce the following guests to you. Paul.
Morning, Simon. Paul Williams. I'm an independent advisor, and for the purposes of this webinar, I'm formerly of the Bank of England PRA, where I was Chief Architect of the Operational Resilience Regulations.
Naomi.
Thanks, Simon, and morning, everyone. I look after operational resilience at VocaLink, which is part of MasterCard, but I'm joining this webinar with a sort of breadth of experience across operational resilience, looking after that at a large UK bank, a mid-tier, and now a tech firm.
Gareth.
Thank you, and morning everybody. My name is Gareth Dickey and I'm the Head of ServiceNow and Enterprise Tech Data for Lloyds Banking Group. So I'm here from the tech and data angle about operational resilience.
And Ewan.
So my name's Ewan Donald. I'm the Head of Resilience at Aberdeen Group.
And Stuart.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Stuart Burnley. I'm the Managing Partner here at Pulsar Consulting, and I've had the privilege of working in risk and resilience now for over 25 years.
Fantastic. So we will just quickly go to the agenda. So we've got 4 sections of the webinar for you today. We have Paul giving us a state of the nation to kick off with, to get us going. We'll follow that with a short discussion with Paul for about 10 minutes, just picking up on some of the key points that he makes. And Naomi is going to join me for that. And then we'll go to a panel. And the panel will start to look at some of the technology and data and process implications of what we hear. And we'll finally have a Q&A at the end, which I will moderate. So Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much. So look, as an independent advisor, I talk to many firms and I wanted to share my thoughts, particularly through the lens as an ex-regulator and a specialist supervisor, how I think we're doing against the regulations. At another event midway through the implementation window, I assessed that the finance sector was a mixed ability class, and I think that assessment still holds. There are firms that have enthusiastically embraced the concepts set out in the regulations, and I believe that they've found them useful in advancing their operational resilience capability. But today I'm going to focus my remarks on the less successful aspects of implementation that I see, and as is my way, I'm going to embrace my inner supervisor and be a little bit provocative to drive an active discussion. There are, of course, outliers in both directions, so if I offend anyone, my comments clearly weren't meant for you, they're meant for someone else. But my comments do reflect the general themes that I encounter. So if I had to answer in a single sentence what my primary assessment is, I would refer us all to Goodhart's law. Charles Goodhart observed that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And that, I think, captures the warning about where we are on operational resilience implementation. What was supposed to be a measure of how well a firm could continue to provide critical services through severe but plausible disruption has, in too many cases, I think, become a target to be hit and a board paper to presented. Important business services have been mapped, impact tolerances have been set, self-assessments have been written, some at considerable length, all in the name of being compliant with the regulations. But being compliant with the regulations does not necessarily make you resilient. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a lot of construction activity, new frameworks, significant investments in technology, but often a focus on making sure not to spend more than any other comparable firm whilst being compliant rather than being truly resilient. Resilience programs exist with their own brand, their own steering committee, maybe even their own merchandise. And meanwhile, the threats may be flowing through the gaps no one has fortified. Persistent legacy technology, which we've optimistically renamed as heritage technology, the third parties no one has fully mapped, and the critical processes that turn out to be dependent on a single spreadsheet that someone's forgotten about. And then perhaps most importantly, the data that nobody trusts because nobody has ever cleaned it. So resilience, properly understood, is not a construction, it is a capability. And capability, unlike construction, doesn't photograph well for the annual report. The second pattern I want to name is what we might call the Procrustean mistake. I was looking for synonyms, and this is a good one. Procrustes, you may know from Greek mythology, was an innkeeper of unusually firm views on customer service. He had a single iron bed, and he insisted that every guest fit it precisely. Guests who were too short, he stretched on a rack, and guests who were too long, he amputated to length. And apparently reviews on this practice on the ancient equivalent of TripAdvisor were mixed. The relevance is a great many firms have approached the definition of important business services in much the same way. They began with their existing product taxonomy or service catalogue because it was organisationally more straightforward in a compliance implementation mode rather than embracing the spirit of the regulations and fundamentally reassessing how services are delivered. And this is despite specific language in the regulations advising against that approach. So IBS definitions have often been stretched or trimmed to fit the framework, and the result is a list of important business services that maps very tidily onto the organisation chart, but maps very poorly onto how the business actually fails. And failure modes do not respect product lines. They cut savagely across them. The regulation was deliberately drafted to require a granularity, pushing firms beyond the marketing brochure and into the specifics of real intolerable harm, focused on service outcomes. Many firms responded by being as granular as the marketing brochure and no more. They also invested in resilience trimmed to the budget appetite rather than to the need. They then bought a great deal of technology to make the marketing brochure highly available, which often places an unreasonable burden on technology to build reliability and redundancy into services, rather than truly understanding the service outcomes and building resilience capability there. The third thing I want to say, which I thought should be obvious, but I still don't think is that risk and resilience are not the same thing. They are related, but they are not the same. Yes, there are real challenges in integrating resilience thinking into existing non-financial risk management frameworks, but that's entirely the point. Risk management is a discipline of probability. It asks what could go wrong, how likely is it, and what is the expected loss. And in that sense, it's a discipline of avoidance and mitigation. But resilience is a discipline of consequence. It asks when things go wrong, not if, when, can we continue to deliver what matters and can we recover? And therefore, it's a discipline of endurance and adaptation. You can run a perfectly compliant risk function and still be operationally fragile. You can have a wonderfully coloured heat map and still discover that your firm cannot make payments on a Tuesday morning because the cloud service provider is having a bad day. The two disciplines need to coexist, but they require different muscles, different mindsets, and likely different people in the room. And conflating them, I think, is the single most common issue I see. A great many firms have spent the last 3 years making their risk framework slightly tidier and calling it resilience, or perhaps rebranding business continuity into operational resilience without fundamentally changing what's done. And this brings me to a question that I'm told is now often asked in supervisory meetings, the question being, what does a minimum viable version of your firm look like? If you had to keep the lights on through a genuinely severe disruption, not a tabletop scenario, but a real one, the kind nobody had on their bingo card in January, what would you have to keep running? Who would you have to keep paying? And what could you, in extremis, switch off, and for how long before the impacts become intolerable? Not inconvenient, not against risk appetite, but truly intolerable. They're difficult questions, and the very worst time to answer those questions is when you're in the middle of a crisis. Yeah, I'm told that this question is causing a certain amount of excitement. My view is that it really shouldn't. If a firm has done its operational resilience work honestly, the answer should be self-evident. And therefore, a minimum viable firm is in practice not a new concept. And it's certainly not the supervisors moving the goalposts. It's the logical conclusion of every important business service exercise ever conducted. And if you cannot describe yours easily, then I don't think that's a problem with the question. I think it's a problem with how you've gone about the answer. which all means that although we've made a tremendous amount of progress, I think we need a bit of a reset on resilience. But what does that look like? Well, for me, there would be three things. Firstly, more honesty in scoping. Fewer important business services defined more precisely and anchored in genuine customer harm rather than internal taxonomy. And if your list of IBSs reads like the contents page of your annual report, you've probably got more work to do. The more granular your IBS definition, the easier and likely less expensive it is to define the necessary resilience measures, but it requires a genuinely joined up conversation across the firm. Secondly, less reflexive technology spending and more attention to what is already there. Most firms already have a service management platform, in many cases ServiceNow, with rich CMDB and asset data sitting inside it. But many firms are not fully utilising what they have and what they've already paid for. And the unglamorous truth is that data hygiene, properly resourced and properly governed, may move the resilience needle further than another procurement cycle. Sometimes the answer is staring you in the face. It's just been badly tagged. And third, a serious reckoning with third, fourth and nth party dependencies. The DORA Register of Information deadline fell 2 days before the UK Operational Resilience Regulation's first anniversary. And the questions DORA forces firms to ask are questions that UK firms should already have been asking themselves. Your nth party risk is not somebody else's problem. It is by definition your problem, but with extra spice. Yes, it's hard, but that's a problem we have created and it's a problem that we have to fix. And then coming to my final remarks, I'm sure you've noticed that the threat landscape we're operating in today has never been more challenging. Almost every week seems to bring a new challenge and bring into sharp relief the fragility of the interconnected, interdependent metagrid that defines modern life, which means that being truly resilient and not just compliant has never been more necessary. And what worked yesterday is unlikely to be sufficient tomorrow. And in that sense, I'm going to leave you with a thought from a novel called The Leopard. It contains a line that I think every operational resilience programme should have framed somewhere on its wall. In the novel, the young aristocrat Tancredi, watching the world he was born into come apart around him, says to his uncle, if we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. And I don't think that's bad advice for an industry standing at the 1 year mark of a regulation that in too many places has been treated as something to be survived rather than something to be used. We've been given a framework. I'm clearly biased, but I think it's an excellent one. We have on the whole met its letter. The next month and the years are going to be about its spirit. Supervisors likely have two base questions about a firm they're supervising. Is my firm resilient enough, and how do I know? And when you can answer both of those questions about your firm with confidence, then I think we will have pushed through the risk management and compliance barriers and reached genuine resilience territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Some fantastic analogies there, which I'm sure we'll come back to. My first question, and I'll ask you and then ask Naomi to comment as well. One of the things that struck me was honesty in scoping and important business services. And are you suggesting that there should be sufficient focus on business services that are therefore not important, as well as important business services, and more of a distinction between those?
Well, that's an interesting question. To know what's important, you do have to know what's not important. And good looks like having a list of things that you've described as important and a list of things you've disregarded as not being important. That doesn't mean they're unimportant to the organisation, because importance is a context-sensitive term. Everything is important to somebody, depending on where they sit in the organisation, the mission they're performing. But that somewhat frames the difficulty in having an honest conversation around what important business service outcomes actually are. If you get the boardroom together and ask everyone who sits around the boardroom table for what's important, they'll likely indicate that what's what's in their responsibility should be in that list, because that's how they justify their position, remuneration around the table. But it's not actually true. And if you can get past that conversation and have a conversation about outcomes instead, that becomes even more difficult, because no outcome that a business produces is ever produced by a single organisational unit. It's produced as a result of lots of units coming together. And having an honest conversation across those units and traversing the politics, I think, is the key to defining what's important, rather than getting fixated on the product or catalogue, which is the easy but not necessarily the effective answer.
Interesting use of the word politics as well. Naomi, I know you've
Simon,
got lots of experience.
Yeah, can I come in on that actually? I wanted to just pick the same point up, because I think talking about honesty in mapping is deliberately a little bit provocative, and I might slightly reframe it to say actually maybe the minimum level of service or the minimum viable product is a really interesting lens to help organisations to mature how they're thinking about their IBSs. So, for example, if actually that process, that compliance process has been followed, and you've got your important business service and you've done your dependency mapping and you've ticked those boxes, then if you're challenged by the logic of a minimum level of service or a minimum viable product, and you go away and say, actually, we think that core recovery, the thing that matters most and creates the greatest harm, is slightly lesser, then actually I'll be encouraging firms to take that back into their annual review of their important business services, or to then redefine their IBS and say, actually, we challenged ourselves on this. We think the scope's slightly less. Let's go and have that conversation with our executive and our board, because actually when we're really in the proverbial, it's these things that would matter. And that's also where the scenario testing comes in, to really force that conversation of, okay, you've got to get this within impact tolerances. So what really, really matters and where's really the harm? And I would say it is about being honest and facing into that, but it's maybe more about the maturing of the processes that exist, which, Paul, I think totally goes to the heart of that ongoing reset, that shift from compliance to really thinking about the outcomes that we're driving and the harm that we're causing. Feel fair?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fine. I mean, it brings to mind the cliche, right, that it's a journey, not a destination.
For sure.
The challenge, I think, that I see is often a degree of nervousness around reframing IBSs, particularly reducing the number or the scope of an IBS, because if you're stuck in a regulatory compliance mindset, there then becomes a compliance fear of, well, how's the regulator going to react to that? Oh, should we be saying that? And that's the wrong question. The wrong question, to your point, is if it's the lived experience of the organisation, it's the right thing to do, then it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think that's to your point, is absolutely the shift. And that feeling confident and mature enough to say, actually, this is what's important for the organisation and our customers, or whoever's feeling that harm, perhaps less about ticking the box and saying, well, we've got 25, so we need to stick with 25, otherwise it looks a bit off. Understood.
Yeah.
Just to remind the audience that there is a comment section. Please do ask questions. We've got a Q&A at the end, so we can come back to those. Impact tolerances. Paul, how do you think about those? I think over the years, their primacy in the kind of language has varied, and how do you see impact tolerances kind of in the current environment?
Well, let me answer that with an observation. More than one firm has said to me in the past that we can't keep this service within impact tolerance, so we're going to risk accept that we can't stay within impact tolerance, which is kind of misses the point. And there's a risk that the term intolerable harm has become a financial services terminology rather than stopping to understand what it actually says, which is it's intolerable. You can't risk accept something that's intolerable. So if you're in a position where you think you can have a conversation about risk accepting intolerable harm, then you've either not understood what intolerable harm is, or you've specified it incorrectly and it's not truly intolerable. And I think that also then it's a simple concept to describe, a challenging concept to implement. But again, that's entirely the point. because it's what constitutes intolerable harm is unlikely to be aligned to your existing risk appetite. Risk appetite generally describes something that the organisation feels it can accept, but intolerable harm, if looked at correctly, probably crystallises some point sooner than your risk appetite, because you're describing intolerable harm on your customers. But then being really clear on what actually is intolerable in an outcome context. I've worked with a number of insurance companies, and one of the important business services that insurance companies tend to land on is first notification of loss. That's a good example of an important business service because it's not a product or a service, it's transversal across all insurance products. But the intolerable harm that comes from first notification of loss for a minor motor traffic accident or a pet insurance policy claim is not the same as might happen if you've got emergency medical assistance required as part of a travel insurance policy. So being even more refined as to what the real intolerable harm outcome is I still think there's work to do on defining impact tolerances. And it's a product of getting your IBS definition wrong, right? If you've got your IBSs defined at a product level, then you're going to have real trouble articulating what your impact tolerance is.
And I guess that is a very relevant example for this conflation of risk and resilience that you talked about earlier.
Right.
How do you see the influence on resilience programs balancing between regulatory and executive influence?
I had an interesting observation a few months ago. I was asked to do a presentation to the board of a large bank, and it was sponsored by the board, not the executive, and they were particularly interested in understanding third-party risk through the lens of the global regulatory expectation. But they also invited the executive to the presentation, and we had a good long discussion with the board and the executive. What struck me about the outcome was the feedback that came after that presentation. The feedback that came from the executive was that was fascinating, but we didn't learn anything we didn't already know. The feedback from the board was that was fascinating and we learned a ton. And as long as that difference exists between what the board and the executive know and understand about resilience expectations and posture of the organisation, then I think there's more work to do.
Yes, very, very interesting. So I'm going to move us on to our panel now. So bear with us as we bring the panel up and for Stuart to continue the conversation.
Excellent. And while everyone is just appearing on screen, a massive thank you to Paul, Simon and Naomi for taking us through that. As Simon just said, if you've got any questions, please put them in the comments panel that is on your screen, because we will come to them in about 15 minutes time. So one of the things that Paul talked about was the importance of having the right data foundations in place in order to get the benefits from your investments in technology. So what I'd like to do now with the panel we have in front of us is drill down a little bit on that to get our respective practical experiences of doing that. And I want to start with yourself, Gareth. And what the question is to get us started is, what would you say are the keys to success when it comes to op resilience data, and why is that so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So data is a really hot topic across every industry at the minute, and I feel like everyone is working on keeping it simple. So we've got these masses and masses of data sets, and we don't really know what to do with them. So everybody's bringing it back down to bare bones and basics. And if I try and bring this into operational resilience and what it's trying to do, it's not really achieved through like recovery, but through trusted decision grade data. And that's what we're aiming for. So the fundamentals for me are clarity of purpose. So the data must serve the resilience outcomes, and it needs to answer specific questions, not just in case, so that we're cutting down that data set and have less to actually manage. So what are important business services? what resources underpin them, and what assets do we worry about, suppliers, locations, etc. And the success really comes from what is explicitly mapped to impact tolerance testing, scenario testing, and decision making, not just documentation. We also need authoritative sources, not multiple versions of the truth. So we need clear systems of record and explicit acceptance that perfect data is not required, but authoritative. And that's where we get resilience improvement. And then again, the minimum viable data, so not exhaustive completeness. So what are we doing to focus on service mapping and dependency and not trying to model the entire world?
Yeah, I love it. I love the point around about, less data and being focused. I think data is one of these words that means many things to many people, and you can overcomplicate it a lot, but being focused on what is the data that's driving these important business services is absolutely critical. And Ewan, from your perspective, what are some of the challenges that you've experienced around about data and sharing with the attendees? How have you went about addressing them?
Yeah, sure. I think one of our main themes around data is always comes back to data ownership and accountability. And also, I think at a more organizational level, in how interconnected our data sets are and what that can then tell us in terms of our overall resilience. So, we've recently gone through a ServiceNow implementation on the resilience side, which has really forced us to address some of those challenges. I think we made the very early decision not to take in bad data, or certainly data that required improvement, into the UpRes and the BCM modules. And what that's really forced us to do is to look at the connection between our resilience data and some of our risk management data. And Paul mentioned earlier on that risk and management and UpRes are looking to do different things, and that's absolutely correct. But I think we had, for example, BIA data, which was cut at a sort of business function or a department level. We have an IBS view, which takes a more holistic process view with all the associated kind of mapping that you'd expect. And then we've got the view of the business from an enterprise risk management framework perspective with kind of KBOs linked to risks and controls. And what we found, or what the issue that was surfaced, which we knew was there, but this is kind of forcing us to address, is that all of those data sets need to speak to each other at some point in the process, to allow you to kind of draw meaningful conclusions. So what we've done as part of the project is to review our business services with each business within the group. Those business services are then mapped between all the modules within ServiceNow, so they're using the same source data. So we've got process BIAs linked to the business process. We've got our important business services drawing on that same source data, and similarly for our kind of second line view. So we'll be able to see, for example, control performance in the risk management world against IBS in a way that we can't easily do at the moment. So to go back to your initial question, I think the challenges are absolutely about ownership, and about the interrelatedness of data. But we are progressing down a route which will allow us to get better insights, really drive more informed decisions, which then should help us be more resilient as an organisation.
Excellent, thank you, Ewan. And connecting, what Gareth said with what you've said, having worked with yourselves, is I think having that minimum viable product when it comes to data and really being focused on the important business services and the technology assets of the third parties that enable them is what has allowed you to be able to then drive some of that benefit from the technology implementation, which we'll come back to in a second. But before we do that, Naomi, I wanted to pick up on something you said in the first part, and it's almost reframing the question I've just asked. But Clearly, one of the reasons we're all doing this operational resilience game is so that if an incident does arise, we can respond and recover in a controlled and timely manner. And I was interested when you mentioned scenario testing. So my question is around, where do you see the importance of data, firstly in the ability to respond and recover if we do have an incident, and secondly in scenario testing? And what would you say to attendees they should be thinking about now?
Thanks, Stuart, and hopefully you can hear me. Give me a nod up, a nod, because I'm having real connection challenges, so I'm so sorry. Just picking up on Ewan's point, I think there's a really important point for recovery as well as delivery of services, which is the governance, the ownership, the clarity of data and what it does. I think when you look at that through a scenario testing or response and recovery lens, it's an interesting question as to whether it's the same data that you need for delivery of a service versus recovery of a service, question mark. And then when you're requiring that data for recovery of your service, do you know firstly where it is, where it's backed up, and have you tested that backup capability, and is that built into your recovery plans? And that level of detail is really important for the response and recovery. I'd also say that, and again echoing Ewan a little bit, for response and recovery, just like sort of the linkage of risk management and controls to operational resilience, it's the joining of dots. It's similar with recovery and scenario testing. It's the joining of all of those dots that bring so many different things together to demonstrate improved recovery capability, and data, as we know, is a critical part of that.
Yeah, spot on, Naomi. And I'm interested, Gareth, you, and whether you would add anything to that in terms of, scenario testing and the use of data in scenario testing, because, I certainly remember way back when, scenario testing used to be getting everyone around a table and doing it that way. I'm interested in your views in terms of that, how that might have evolved and what your experiences have been.
I was just going to pick up on a point that Naomi made about the data sets being the same for introducing a service versus recovering a service. And I would almost argue that you shouldn't be introducing any sort of service that you can't recover. So playbooks, runbooks, what you do in those scenarios needs to be embedded into the DNA of what you build and what you put live for your customers. And it is all coming full circle, whereas previously it was kind of a camp or a faction delivering a service, then a camp and faction running said service, and then what happens if it fails. That's all getting amalgamated and merged, and as such the data sets are amalgamating and merging as well. So when it comes to the specifics on scenario, I would say that that data is being used in anger for scenario testing. It has moved away, in my experience, from a let's sit around a table with a sheet in front of us and go, right, what would we do if, and being more data-led, bit of automation in there. We can do chaos testing through some of the new modern engineering tooling that we have to go, what if, said server fails, what if AWS went out? Not that that's a real example, of course.
Yeah, totally. So I'm going to draw a line under our discussion around about data, and so I'll move it on a little bit in terms of technology. So clearly, I think we all accept that once you start embarking on getting the data in the right place and improving the data, that's enabling you to, get the proactive insights that you want through technology, and also to start managing some of your operational resilience processes and workflows. Ewan, I'm going to come to you first with the question on, how do you ensure that you get the benefits and the user adoption from your technology implementations? And I totally appreciate that your implementation literally went live less than 2 weeks ago, so it's hot off the press. So, I'd be keen to understand what you think is working well for you at the moment in terms of getting that user adoption, and what your focus is going to be on for the next period of time.
Yeah, sure. I think key for us has been our organizational context, in the sense that there's a general push towards using ServiceNow for various different things, so including our sort of enterprise risk management. We've got third-party module. We've got various modules now, which is really pushing everyone in the business to kind of upskill, not just kind of IBS owners or those who might be involved from a resilience or a BCM lens. I'd say we're in the fortunate position that we're maintaining our previous platform for a period of time, which means that we've not had the challenge of kind of big bang adoption. What that's allowed us to do is that we've got workshops with IBS owners, for example, to really walk through both the system and how the approach that we've been running for the last 4 years kind of works within the technology. Really, I think emphasizing that we're not allowing the kind of technology to force how we do this. We're doing process first, and then making sure that the technology can support that, and really underlining the kind of benefits. So I think the benefit of that will be to demonstrate how we can leverage that technology. So by setting up favorites with individuals, by talking through dashboards, and really explaining how we can get some of that insight into the hands of the people who are going to be using it, rather than saying, here's a link, kind of go in and work it out for yourself. So yes, we're quite at the beginning, I suppose, of that journey of user adoption over the piece. But I think that's the approach we're taking, and will give us the best results, I think.
Yeah, and it links to the point that Paul made earlier, and I promise I never paid him to say it, around about, if you've got a CMDB, in your case through the ServiceNow technology, then looking to see how you can leverage that data rather than spinning up separate projects, etc. And yeah, I completely agree with that. And Naomi, from your perspective, having been involved in this space for a period of time, what do you see and reflect on in terms of technology implementations and driving that user adoption?
So I think my reflection is always, and Paul sort of alluded to it actually, is always focusing on the impact of what you're doing and how that's reduced, what that means for the customer. What's the sell? What's the linkage? What's the joining of the dots to what you're implementing, to what it enables you to do, to how it then enables you to reduce harm somewhere along the line? And I think, with anything technology driven, being able to bring that to life in terms of either a customer lens or a harm lens is a really important way of just gaining buy-in, gaining understanding and gaining buy-in to then you use the tools and technology that are available. A really important part of the sell.
Yeah, agreed. And Gareth, you've been on the journey within Lloyds for maybe a wee bit longer than certainly Ewan has, given he went live a couple of weeks ago. What's your reflections in terms of what's worked well for you? What are maybe some lessons learned when it comes to technology implementation and driving user adoption?
So I think we have to meet people where they are. Resilience isn't an abstract away from what they do day in, day out, and merging the two together, as in, what happens to this customer if this fails? What does that mean about your service? And then what do you need to do with that or with your technology to make sure that we can recover? Almost piecing that story together so that resilience isn't an add-on to their day-to-day work is quite important. And moving on from that, I think, visibility and leadership, so making sure that leaders are talking about this day in, day out with their teams, and also giving that psychological safety around it. Because if things are shown up through a resilience assessment or anything that's done in that respect, it's not a failing, it's a learning opportunity to get data more correct, to look at the processes, and then to make sure that we can recover if and when something goes wrong.
Yeah, I love it. Making it real for everybody so that they engage with it and embrace it is absolutely fantastic. I'm going to say we're probably about 5 minutes away from questions, so if anyone's got any, please put them in the comments panel. I'm going to finish this section by talking about AI. We couldn't possibly do a data and technology webinar without referring to AI. So I'm going to come to each of you individually to understand what are you currently doing related to AI in the ops resilience space? And where do you see the opportunities and challenges moving forward? And Ewan, I'll come to you first this time.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I mean, I think in the immediate, sort of short and medium term, we're using it to help us analyze data more efficiently and to help us draw those conclusions, which can then feed into governance and decision-making processes. And I think that's where there's going to be a real kind of short to medium term benefit for me. Thinking of last year, the AWS global outage, and we'd had a similar scenario test actually just a couple of months before that along a similar line. I think for us, certainly that kicked off a lot of questions about exposure to underpinning cloud service providers. And I think the exciting thing for me is using that as an example, getting answers to some of those questions. And it comes back to our point about data. If your data's good and it's connected properly, then I think AI can really help in kind of analysing, drawing out some of the so what, which can then fill in or kind of feed into your decision-making processes. So, I think that's maybe a kind of obvious one in terms of analysis, but I think that's starting to come through. I think it will also really help with testing and going back to what we mentioned a little while ago. I think we should get to that point where you can see how a particular scenario will impact any kind of component of your IBS, or see that more easily, which should help to deepen our understanding of our ability to operate within impact tolerance against different scenarios. So, I'm quite excited about the potential for AI to help with scenario testing and to I think give us a little bit more confidence maybe in the conclusions that we're drawing as a result of our testing. So those are the key things for me.
Fantastic, thank you. Ewan and Naomi, anything you would add to that?
I'd echo a lot of that. I think AI is super exciting in what it can bring, but I think, there will be differing levels of maturity in how it's being used. I think foundationally, again, to Ewan's point, being confident that your data is governed appropriately, of the right quality, you understand the data, is really important before you layer the AI over the top. But then actually, what can it do for us? It's joining the dots at scale, to put it in the colloquial language, whether that's going right back to the start of this webinar, bringing risk and resilience data together so you understand your control posture, you have a more in-depth understanding of your likelihood of a particular scenario emerging and the risk associated with that. So that's more granular, all the way into situational awareness of actually what's going on out there when you're in the middle of a crisis, to give you that sort of reputational view, very quickly media view, all the way into your recovery capability and scenario testing. So I think there's lots of exciting use cases out there. It's just getting ourselves ready for those and using them in the right way.
Yeah, I agree. I think the exciting bit that you've both said is, AI being able to read across the data, and, what I see now in my world is that what's very real is things like automation for continuous controls monitoring, for key risk indicators, but where AI is starting to come in that space is then reading across those and pulling in maybe incident data as well, or change data or SecOps data in there as well, so that you can start getting to that utopia we've all talked about for many years, where you can be proactive and try and anticipate some of these incidents before they actually materialise. Gareth, just finally then, is there anything from your side that you're seeing from an AI perspective?
I think I would echo what's been said. We do have to be a bit cautious because it's not going to fix bad data. So having that foundation right is essential to see what we can do with it. Once we've got that cracked, sky's the limit. And I think the really exciting part, sort of ops res adjacent, is what it's going to do in real scenarios. So how is it going to reduce mean time to recovery? How is it going to support recovery managers when things go wrong? And can we see the benefit that it brings in stressful situations to reduce that cognitive load on people?
Yeah, I agree. And I'm just going to pick up on a point that I think you've all kind of touched on, is that, my simple head thinks about this in two ways. There's one, how can we leverage AI for our benefit, not resilience? But the other point is, how do we ensure that AI doesn't actually cause an operational resilience event? And that's where the governance becomes really important, in having that AI inventory and then the right risks and controls in place to monitor it. So yeah, I completely agree. So thank you very much for that. I might invite Simon and Paul back into the studio now, as we say, just so we can cover any questions that have came in beforehand, those that have been raised during the course of the webinar.
Thanks, Stuart. And please do keep the questions coming through the comments as we go through. So the first one I'm going to take is linked to the conversation we just had around people using stressed exit test outcomes. Could the panel comment on how they're using stressed exit test outcomes? And maybe I'll go to you first, Naomi.
Sorry, Simon, how we're using stress testing outcomes that we said there. Sorry, I'm still having some connection challenges. Yeah. Look, I think these are all data points that we need to take in and absorb and think about what they mean on that end-to-end continuum of resilience. So actually, undertaking that stressed exit, doing that less, to use Paul's language, perhaps less from a compliance tick box and more from a, what's this really telling us? What really happens when we're in this incident tomorrow? What are we actually going to do? I think is that next stage of maturity, so that we either understand that there's a challenge there, or actually there are some real solutions that we need to put in place to address that. So I think it's getting into that more granular assessment and working, I've been around resilience for a long time. This still feels like a bit of an elephant in the room, is the third party relationships, the way in which we're all working across that end-to-end continuum. Are we ticking the box, or are we really having those open, and I'll use the word honest again, conversations about what would really happen in this situation, and what would we do as an organisation, and what would we do with this third party? So that's the thinking I think as a collective industry we still need to be doing.
Would anyone like to add to that?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think what we find is, in terms of testing, there's almost been sort of a few phases of thinking about this. So, from a scenario testing perspective, we look at IBS, we think about, under that scenario, how can we prove our ability to operate with impact tolerance? We're looking at sort of scenario tests. Are we looking at a crisis management exercise? Are we looking at cyber, penetration testing? All this testing that occurs across the piece, how that all connects together, and how that can kind of, what that can tell us about a capability. But I think we're getting to a point now where we're thinking about some of these other tests that are maybe been on the periphery of those conversations, but are now kind of coming back in. So I think, exit planning and tests is a really good one. Similarly, wind down planning, those are exercises that we have to run at a business level. And we're really thinking about how we can connect those discussions that are having there into a kind of crisis management exercise. How do the inputs and outputs kind of speak to each other, so we can kind of draw meaningful conclusions? So, yeah, I think I agree with you. I think this is one that's definitely a flavour of the month for a lot of firms, and something that we're absolutely looking at bringing into the overall kind of OpRes program.
Any other perspectives? Okay. I'll move to a slightly different question around, is picking up on this conversation earlier around minimum viable bank or minimum viable entity. Does that necessarily drive to a smaller number of IBS And I think the second part of the question is, what about internal services, however they've been described as part of that? Paul, I'll come to you first on that.
So the answer is yes and no. And what I mean by that is that there is an element of defining a minimum viable firm which is not optional, which was the point I think I was making in my remarks, what you absolutely must provide. But there's also an element, there is also legitimately some discretion in what you might put into a minimum viable firm and when you might put it in. And I think if you don't answer those questions separately, you'll get horrendously confused around what your position of a minimum viable firm actually is. And therefore, I think you have to start with what's truly minimal. And then if you're dealing with, which touch wood, none of the FS firms have had to, a catastrophic cyber outage lasting weeks or months, you're going to have to change what that minimum viable firm looks like over a period of time, right? The best example I've got to illustrate that actually comes from outside financial services, and I speak with no knowledge or authority other than observation and being a customer of Marks and Spencer's. Okay? I went into their Oxford Street branch at some point during their incident last year to use the foreign exchange counter. It never occurred to me that the foreign exchange counter wouldn't be available, and it was available, but not in the way that you might think. In that the lady behind the counter could do my foreign exchange transaction, but she had a printout of FX rates, she had a calculator, and she had a carbon copy receipt book. So in doing my foreign exchange transaction, she had to do it all manually armed with those three things. Now, was that necessary? Was that a must-have on day one of their incident? I'm assuming it almost certainly was not. But at some point during the minimum viable recovery journey, they concluded that was something they could live with on a minimum viable basis for a period of time until they could get the full service back and running. And I think that optionality describes the challenge in what an MVB actually is, because you've got what it absolutely must be at the beginning, and then what your perspective will change on that over time, depending on how you recover and how you prioritise service outcomes.
Anyone else like to add to those comments on the minimum viable point?
So maybe can I just say one thing, which is echoing Paul really, but I don't think there's a right and a wrong number of IBSs, and I think that's been true right from the inception of operational resilience. And I think it's okay to challenge your thinking and evolve as long as there's logic and rationale to that. And to Paul's point, you can perhaps say that actually through this testing, through this scenario testing, we understand actually that we would do these things differently, or we would not worry so much about this. And I think that's where the power of using the current threat environment and the extremity of the current threat environment to really challenge your thinking has great power for organisations, but may then take them to a different place.
Thank you. There's a question around AI and whether or not people feel optimistic or nervous. I think we answered that actually in the earlier conversation. I certainly came away feeling that there's a lot to be positive around in terms of the use of AI over the data that we have in operational resilience, but also, I guess, even-handed that there might be some more threats brought about by the use of AI. Any other sort of final observations around that before we close?
I think my answer to that question, Simon, would be nervously optimistic. I agree with all the previous points around data and using AI to look across your data, provided you've got confidence that your data is complete. I think that's all true. In the threat environment, I was asked this question last week, actually, at a different event, and I made the observation there that in cyber, the most powerful intervention, perhaps, that financial regulators have made was CBEST or Tiber EU or CORI, depending on which part of the world you live in. And the point about that is that they were using the tactics, techniques, and procedures of the threat actors on your own organisation before they got to you. The same is true of AI in a threat environment. If they're going to use AI against you, then you need to use AI against yourself first. The challenge is, what does that transition period look like, and how vulnerable are you during that transition period? And it may also expose inconvenient truths. I touched on one earlier, but the persistence of legacy technology may become even more of an acute problem through the lens of AI than perhaps you've been able to get away with in the past.
Thank you. Conscious that we need to finish at midday, so I'll wrap us up there. Thank you, everybody, for a fantastic discussion today, and thank you, everybody, for joining us online. And look out for the next in the series, where we'll be talking about third parties. Thank you.